She told me to leave like it was nothing, like grief had an expiration date and mine had just run out. After my husband died, the house went quiet in a way that felt unnatural, and that's when my daughter-in-law stopped seeing me as family and started treating me like a problem that needed fixing. The house didn't creak when I woke up, it just sat there, holding its breath. Before we go any further, if stories like this feel familiar or hit close to home, go ahead and like this video and subscribe. It helps keep these quiet stories alive. Now, let me tell you about the morning after the funeral. The black dress was still hanging over the back of the dining chair, right where I dropped it, like it gave up before I did. It smelled faintly of church dust and old perfume, the kind women wear when they don't want anyone to notice they've been crying. I ran my fingers over the fabric and felt how cold it still was, like it hadn't warmed back up yet, like it didn't belong to me anymore. The house felt heavier than the casket ever did, not louder, just heavier. Every room held on to something. The hallway kept his footsteps, the kitchen kept his cough. The living room still leaned toward the recliner like it was waiting for him to sit down and complain about the news. I stood at the sink with a chipped mug of coffee I didn't want, watching steam rise and disappear before it reached my face. No one spoke. Some silence feels gentle. This one didn't. My daughter-in-law moved through the house like she already knew where everything was supposed to go. Cabinets opened and closed softly, controlled, like she was cleaning up after a storm that embarrassed her. She didn't look at me. When she passed behind me, I caught her perfume, clean, sharp, the kind that lingers. She used to hug me when she wore it. That morning, she walked right past. I told myself not to read into it. Grief makes people strange, sharp around the edges. That's what I told myself. Black dresses hung limp over chairs like tired birds, sleeves brushing the floor every time someone walked by. Nobody picked them up. Nobody mentioned them. We were all pretending not to see things that hurt. She spoke once, early on, said the coffee was fresh, not that she made it, just that it existed. I nodded like that was enough. We sat at opposite ends of the table, a whole life between us. Her phone lit up once. She turned it face down without reading it. Her fingers tapped twice on the wood, then stopped. I watched her hands. They were steady. Mine weren't. As the morning dragged on, she started moving things, not throwing anything out, just rearranging. A photo frame shifted, a stack of mail relocated, the house changing in inches. I followed the sounds instead of the sight, drawers sliding shut, cabinet latches clicking, chair legs nudged closer to the wall. Each sound felt final. At noon, she asked if I'd eaten. I said I wasn't hungry. She nodded like she expected that. By evening, the house felt smaller, like the walls leaned inward when no one was looking. That night, I noticed the first lock, the back door. Click. She didn't announce it, didn't look at me, just turned the bolt like it was routine. We never used to lock the doors. My husband liked them open, said a locked house felt like it was hiding something. I didn't say any of that. I just watched her lock the windows too, one by one. That night, my name disappeared from the air. Conversations happened without me. Plans formed quietly. We'll handle it tomorrow. It's probably better this way. We'll talk later. Later sat wrong in my chest. I lay in bed listening to the house relearn its quiet. The mattress dipped where my husband should have been. The floor creaked once, like it remembered. I stared at the ceiling and told myself this was temporary, that everyone grieves differently, that this wasn't about me. I repeated it until it almost sounded true. The next morning, she stood in the kitchen doorway holding her mug with both hands, looking tired in a way that felt decided. "We should talk later," she said. Just like that. Not, "Can we talk?" Not, "When you're ready." Later. My stomach sank. There was something in her tone, something settled, like she'd already had the conversation in her head and was just waiting for me to catch up. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every creak felt like a question, every silence like an answer I wasn't ready to hear. I realized then that grief doesn't always scream. Sometimes it reorganizes the furniture, sometimes it locks the doors, sometimes it looks at you like the last thing left that doesn't fit. I lay there in the dark, staring at the shape of the door, wondering when my home stopped being mine, and what exactly she planned to say when later finally arrived. I woke up because the house sounded different. Not louder, just rearranged. There's a certain quiet that comes from things being moved while you're asleep. Not stolen or broken, just shifted. Like the walls woke up before you and decided where everything should go. The bed felt unfamiliar under my back. Same mattress, same sheets, but the air was wrong. Colder, thinner, like the room didn't know me anymore. I sat up slowly, and that's when I noticed the boxes stacked neatly along the wall. Brown cardboard with clean edges, labeled in her careful handwriting. Clothes, books, personal. That word sat wrong with me. My clothes were folded tighter than I ever folded them, everything smelling faintly of lemon cleaner, like the house was trying to erase fingerprints. Nothing was thrown out. That part mattered. It was all very polite. My dresser drawers were empty, not slammed shut or left open in accusation, just empty, like they'd never held anything important to begin with. I stood there in my socks, carpet cold under my feet, trying to remember when I stopped being permanent. The hallway felt longer as I walked down it, each step creaking like it was apologizing, like the floor remembered me better than the people did. The guest room door was open wide, the bed made tight with a beige comforter smoothed flat, curtains pulled halfway to let in a pale stripe of morning light that cut across the carpet like a line you weren't supposed to cross. My suitcase sat at the foot of the bed, empty. The room smelled like dust and lemon cleaner, old air, the kind that tells you a room hasn't heard laughter in a long time. The floor didn't creak in here. It didn't know me well enough. She appeared in the doorway while I was holding one of my sweaters like it might explain itself, and said she hoped I didn't mind, figured it'd be easier if everything was already here. She called it temporary, said we all needed space right now, her voice calm, her eyes avoiding mine. I nodded because my throat felt tight, and nodding didn't require sound. She talked about privacy, about rest, then left before I could respond. I sat on the edge of the guest bed and opened a box labeled personal, finding my photo frames stacked face down like old mail, my favorite mug wrapped in yesterday's newspaper. I lay back and stared at the blank ceiling, realizing this room was prepared, not last minute or emotional, but planned. Later in the kitchen, I reached for a drawer and found it reorganized. She said it just made more sense, and I smiled because that's what you do when sense stops including you. She took the chair my husband used to sit in without asking, talked about errands and schedules, and I noticed every sentence curved away from my name. That night I unpacked just enough to feel human, hung 2 dresses, set my toothbrush in a bathroom that still smelled unused, placed 1 photo on the nightstand, and listened as a door down the hall clicked shut and locked. Lying there, staring at a ceiling that didn't know me, I tried to believe this was temporary, that space was healthy, that grief rearranges people the way it rearranges furniture. But one quiet question stayed with me. Space from what? The loss? Or me? And when did this house start feeling like borrowed ground? The coffee had gone cold before either of us noticed. It sat between us on the table, untouched, like it was waiting to hear what we were too careful to say. Morning light crept through the kitchen window in thin strips, landing on the table, but never quite reaching our faces. The house was quiet again, not the heavy quiet from the day before, but something more organized, more intentional. She sat across from me with both hands wrapped around her mug, not sipping, just holding it like warmth was enough. I watched the steam fade. She cleared her throat once, soft and controlled, and said she'd been thinking. I nodded, because I had been too. She traced a small circle on the table with her finger and said we needed to talk about boundaries. Not grief, not loss. Boundaries. The word didn't belong in that room, not where we used to talk about groceries and weather and nothing at all. She said the house needed a fresh start, that her son couldn't heal if everything stayed the same, if the reminders were everywhere. Her voice stayed calm, careful, like she'd practiced saying it out loud. I glanced around at the cabinets, the counters, the small crack in the tile my husband always meant to fix, and thought about how familiar everything still was to me. Fresh start. She finally looked at me then, just for a second, her eyes passing over me like I was part of the furniture she was deciding whether to keep. She said she knew it was hard, but sometimes change was necessary. I heard my husband's laugh in my head, the way he used to say family sticks together like it was a rule, not a suggestion. She kept talking about healing and moving forward, about how grief needs room to breathe, her sentences smooth and logical, already at peace with a decision I'd just been introduced to. I noticed she kept saying he, never we, never us. I wrapped my hands around my mug and took a sip of the bitter, cold coffee anyway. She paused, waiting for me to respond, so I said I raised him here, that I built a life in this house. She nodded, smaller each time, then said it didn't mean it wasn't real, just that it was over. Over. The word landed heavy as I stared at the faint ring left by an old glass on the table, at the scratch from when my husband dropped his keys and laughed. She reached out like she might touch my hand, then stopped, said this was what was best, and I wondered when she decided that. The clock ticked louder than it should have, every second stretched thin. She said she didn't want this to be uncomfortable, and I almost laughed, but my chest was too tight. I asked if that was why my things were moved, and her eyes flicked up for a moment before she said she thought it would be easier, less emotional. Less emotional. She poured the coffee down the sink, the sound louder than it should have been, then talked about lunch and schedules like we'd just discussed the weather. I stayed seated, feeling smaller in the chair than I ever had before, realizing how easy it is to mistake silence for understanding. When she left the room, I stared at the empty mug, then walked down the hallway past the guest room and the bedroom that no longer felt like mine. I stopped at the window and pressed my palm against the glass, thinking about all the promises my husband made in that house and wondering if what she offered was mercy or something else entirely. Because her words were soft, but they were also final. And as the house adjusted around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just setting boundaries, she was redrawing the map, and I was no longer sure where I fit, or if I was meant to at all.
The key felt heavier than it should have, cold and unfamiliar in my palm. I wasn't snooping, that's the truth. I was looking for paperwork, deeds, insurance forms, things with dates and signatures that prove a life happened the way you remember it. The house was quiet again, that midday quiet that settles in once everyone has found their place and stopped pretending otherwise. I stood outside the study holding the small brass key I'd found taped inside an old recipe book, and I didn't remember taping it there, which should have been my first sign. The study still smelled like him, paper and ink and the faint trace of aftershave he never used enough of. The desk sat exactly where it always had, same scuff on the leg, same uneven stack of mail in the corner. The drawer was at the bottom, the one that never opened, the one he always called junk when I asked about it years ago, smiling without using his eyes and saying he'd clean it out someday. I knelt down slowly, slid the key in, hesitated, told myself this was practical, necessary, responsible, then turned it. The click was soft, almost polite, and the drawer opened easier than I expected. Inside were envelopes, dozens of them, yellowed at the edges, neatly stacked and tied together with a thin blue ribbon that had faded almost white. My hands started shaking before I even picked one up. They were addressed to him in handwriting that wasn't mine, careful and personal, slanted just enough to feel intimate. His name looked different in someone else's hand. Then I saw the dates, years overlapping with years I remembered clearly, years I thought I understood. I untied the ribbon with clumsy fingers and opened the first letter, the paper crackling, thin with age, folded like it had been read and reread. The words weren't dramatic, no declarations, no scandal, just tenderness, familiarity, a closeness that didn't need explaining. I read line after line, my chest tightening, realizing they talked about ordinary things, weather, waiting, long drives taken for no reason other than to feel close. They talked about the house, about walking past it without stopping. They never mentioned me, and that hurt more than anything. I sat down on the floor as the past rearranged itself line by line, realizing I hadn't been replaced so much as I'd been parallel, that someone else had known him in ways I thought were mine alone. The letters stopped years before his illness, before things narrowed and slowed, and I sat there surrounded by a life I'd never seen, until the house creaked and footsteps passed down the hallway. I gathered the letters quickly, folded them back, retied the ribbon with shaking hands, slid the drawer shut, and locked it again, the click louder this time. I washed my hands under water that ran too hot and stared at my pale reflection, wondering who else knew, wondering if she knew. The thought lodged deep and wouldn't move. Maybe she'd found the letters first. Maybe that's why the house needed a fresh start, why my things were moved so carefully, so deliberately. Or maybe none of it had anything to do with her, and that somehow felt worse. That night, as she talked about plans and next steps, I watched her hands and the way she avoided my eyes, wondering if she could see the questions sitting just behind my face. Lying in the guest bed later, staring at a ceiling that didn't know me, I thought about the woman in the letters and how many lives this house had held quietly. Some doors don't lock to keep people out, they lock to keep the past from being seen. And now that I'd seen it, I wasn't sure what she knew or what she might do if she found out that I did.
The light above the kitchen table buzzed low and tired, the kind of sound you don't notice until everything else goes quiet. We sat across from each other, with the table wiped clean between us, night pressing against the windows and turning the glass into mirrors. I could see my own face faintly reflected, older than I remembered. She folded her hands, straightened a napkin that didn't need straightening, and said she thought it was time. No lead-up, no cushion. When I asked time for what, she said for me to leave, for good, like she was reading off a list she'd memorized. She said she didn't want drama or drawn-out goodbyes, framed it like kindness, like a favor, said she'd help me pack to make it easier. The word easier landed heavy. My hands were flat on the table, the wood cool and unfamiliar, and when I asked why now, my voice surprised me by staying steady. Her jaw tightened just enough to notice, her eyes drifting anywhere but me, before she repeated that it was just time, and dragging it out wouldn't help anyone. She paced the kitchen with measured steps, talked about moving forward, about how staying wasn't healthy, especially for her son, and I pictured him quiet and hollow these days, never once asking me to leave. I said I hadn't been in his way, and she said that wasn't what this was about, but it felt like it was. She spoke of things staying the same like they were a problem, like I was part of the furniture that needed clearing out. I thought of my husband's laugh, his hand reaching for mine without looking, the way he said this house would always be mine, and wondered if he meant it or just hoped it. She said she didn't want to fight, said this was the right decision, and offered me a few days like it was generosity. When she walked out, the light kept buzzing,
filling the space where explanations should have been. I stayed at the table, replaying her pauses, her tone, the way her jaw tightened when I asked why now, that question sticking deeper than the rest. Not months ago, not right after the funeral. Now, after the guest room, after the boundaries, after the locked drawer I wasn't supposed to open. I turned off the light and walked down the hallway, past the study and the bedroom that no longer felt like mine, into the guest room where the empty suitcase waited at the foot of the bed. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, I realized ultimatums don't always come with raised voices. Sometimes they come quietly, wrapped in kindness and framed like favors. And as sleep crept in, thin and restless, one thought stayed with me. If she was this determined to see me gone, what exactly was she afraid I might find if I stayed?
The air outside felt lighter, like the house had been holding on to me too tightly. I stepped onto the porch just after noon, the door closing softly behind me, the wood groaning under my feet in a way I'd known for decades. The sky was pale and stretched thin, undecided. I hadn't planned on going next door. My feet just carried me there, like my body knew what my heart was avoiding. The neighbor's house looked the same as it always had, white siding, blue shutters, wind chimes tapping together in the slightest breeze. The same sound my husband used to complain about, said it felt like unfinished thoughts. I knocked once and waited, my chest tight in a way I couldn't name. When she opened the door, she smiled softly and said she'd been thinking about me, and I knew she hadn't, but I smiled anyway. She let me in without asking why I was there. Some people just read what's written on your face. Her house smelled like old books and something warm baking, cinnamon maybe, the kind of smell that comes from being lived in without apology. We sat at her kitchen table, the same one we'd sat at years ago talking about weather and mail, and she poured coffee without asking, warm this time, real. She asked how I was holding up, and I nodded and shook my head, and she nodded back like both answers made sense. We sat in silence until she said there was something she didn't know if it mattered anymore, and my chest tightened before she even finished the sentence. She said she remembered things differently, that years back there had been another woman, not often, not living there, but visiting when I wasn't home, parking down the street like she didn't want to be seen. I stared at my coffee and thought of handwriting I already knew. She said there were arguments, too, voices late at night, windows open, things I wasn't home for, and she assumed it was just marriage because everyone fights. Then she hesitated and said my daughter-in-law had been around more near the end than she expected, even when my son wasn't with her, sitting on the porch, going into the study once when the light was on late. The pieces in my mind shifted but didn't fit yet, forming edges I didn't like. I thanked her for the coffee and stood to leave, and she squeezed my arm like an apology she didn't know how to say. Walking back, the house looked the same as always, solid and unbothered, holding more than I ever knew. Inside, my daughter-in-law flipped through mail like nothing had changed, and I wondered if she could see it on my face, the questions, the picture starting to form. That night, in the guest bed, the neighbor's words echoed louder than the house ever had. Another woman, arguments, promises, and I realized the life I lived wasn't a lie, just incomplete. And if she was this determined to send me away, maybe it wasn't just grief she was guarding, but a memory or a secret she needed to keep buried, and I wasn't sure how much time I had left before she made sure it stayed that way. The house was quiet in a different way that afternoon, not tense but resigned, like it already knew what was coming and was tired of pretending otherwise. She was in the living room folding a blanket that didn't need folding, the television off, sunlight slipping through the blinds and striping the floor like a warning you don't notice until you cross it. I stood there longer than I meant to, and she sensed me before she saw me, looked up slowly and said, "Hey." I nodded, didn't sit, didn't smile, just said I needed to talk, and something in my voice must have shifted because she straightened the blanket like armor and said, "Okay." We faced each other with nothing between us but air and everything we hadn't said yet, and I told her I opened the drawer. Just that. Her eyes flicked quick, almost invisible, and when she asked which drawer, I said the locked one in the study, the room shrinking around us. She said I shouldn't have gone through his things, and I said I was looking for paperwork and found letters, and for the first time her mask slipped, something raw flashing across her face. Fear, not anger, not surprise. She looked away first. I asked how long she'd known, and she didn't answer, so I told her I found out yesterday, and she told me to leave that same night, her jaw tightening harder this time. She started to explain, stopped, and in the silence that followed she finally said she was afraid. Afraid I'd claim the house, afraid I'd dig into things better left alone. I nodded slowly and named it for what it was, control, and she didn't deny it. She said her husband, my husband's son, didn't want any of it dragged up, that he promised things would stay the way they were, and when I asked who he promised, she said him and me, the word landing different now. I said that's why she moved my things and gave ultimatums, and she said she was trying to protect him and herself, and when I said I loved him, she nodded, said she knew, and admitted she loved him too, and that was the saddest part. There was no explosion, no shouting, just the truth sitting heavy between us, unavoidable and plain. I said I was still leaving, not because she won, but because I didn't want to stay where my presence felt like a threat, and she accepted it, quieter now. When I asked if she loved him, she said yes, and I believed her. In the guest room, I stared at the suitcase and folded my first shirt into it, thinking about what was left between us, not hatred, not forgiveness, just truth and space, and wondered, when the truth finally comes out, what's supposed to take its place.
The sky was just starting to turn when I zipped the suitcase closed. That pale blue before sunrise that feels like a secret you're not supposed to tell out loud. The house was quiet in a way that felt earned this time, not tense or watchful, just finished, like it had said everything it needed to say and was ready to let me go. I stood in the guest room longer than necessary, the bed made tight again, the lamp off, the room smelling faintly of dust, like it never quite accepted me even in the end. My suitcase sat at my feet, lighter than it should have been, filled only with clothes, a few photos, and the things that didn't argue when you packed them. Everything else stayed. I ran my hand along the dresser one last time, smooth and cold, no history there to fight me. In the hallway, the floor creaked softly beneath my steps, familiar as an old ache, like it was clearing its throat to say goodbye. I paused outside the bedroom that used to be mine, the door open, sunlight touching the edge of the bed and the spot on the wall where our photo once hung. The room smaller now, or maybe always this size. Grief just made it feel bigger before. I didn't go in. Some goodbyes don't need a room. In the kitchen, she stood by the counter with a mug of coffee, shoulders stiffening when she saw the suitcase, then relaxing like she expected it. She said she packed food for the road, and I thanked her, because that part was real and simple and enough. We didn't hug. We didn't need to. She said she'd let him know I left early, and I said I'd rather tell him myself, and she nodded. At the door, she said she hoped I found what I was looking for, and I told her I already did. Outside, the morning air was cool and clean, filling my lungs without asking permission. I set the suitcase in the trunk, gently, and looked back at the house one last time, the porch light still on, like it always was, a habit we never broke, and I didn't turn it off. Some habits don't belong to just one person. I started the car and pulled away, the house shrinking in the mirror, still and solid, not following me, and that surprised me more than it should have. The road stretched ahead, empty and open, fields damp with dew,
the sun rising slow, like it knew there was no rush. I drove without the radio, letting my thoughts come quietly, memories slipping in and out like scenery, the good and the cracked mixed together. Leaving didn't erase any of it. The house could keep the walls and the furniture and the locked drawers, but the memories weren't up for negotiation. I stopped for coffee as the sun fully broke over the horizon, held the warmth between my hands, said good morning to a stranger, and meant it. Back on the road, I rolled the window down and let the air move through me, and for the first time since my husband died, my chest didn't feel tight. I breathed in, then out. No permission needed. I didn't know exactly where I was going yet, only that it was forward, somewhere that space didn't mean being pushed out, but invited in. I thought of the young bride I once was, arriving at that house with a full suitcase and an open heart, believing life could be planned if you tried hard enough, and I smiled at her, kind and quiet. She did her best, and so did I. The road curved gently ahead, giving me time to adjust, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't ask what I'd lost. I asked something else instead, what I might still become now that I was finally free to find out. If you feel comfortable, I'd appreciate it if you left a like on this video. It helps these quiet stories reach the people who might need them most. You can subscribe to the channel if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about love, endurance, and the things we carry longer than we should. And if you want to, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I read them, truly. Knowing this story traveled farther than my living room gives me more comfort than you might imagine. Thank you for sitting with me. Take care of yourself, and take care of the people you love.